I'm Nathan Rutherford, and welcome to Myth Madness. In the previous 4 episodes, I covered the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Their quest was to travel in a ship called the Argo to a faraway land called Colchis. Once there, it was Jason's job to retrieve a magnificent treasure, the Golden Fleece, and bring it back to Greece. The problem was, the fleece was in the possession of a godlike magician king named Aeetes. In the poem The Argonautika, which was the basis of my retelling, the success of Jason and the Argonauts in their adventure mostly revolved around the actions of Aeetes' daughter, Medea. In this episode, I'll continue on from last time and tell what happened to Medea after she returned with Jason to Greece. I'm also going to go into more detail on Medea herself. She already had a well-developed body of material by the time we have her first appearances in the surviving art and literature. This collection of myths connects her with other heroes like Jason, Heracles, and even the god Dionysus. In Greek myth, Medea is something of a traveler. Each of the main stories about her take place in different parts of the ancient Greek world. So this episode is in 3 sections, covering her life in Colchis, outside of Greece, Iolcos, Jason's home, and finally, the city of Corinth. The most detailed account of Medea's time in Colchis comes from Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautika, written in the 3rd century BC. Medea was one of 2 daughters of Aeetes, the king of Colchis, and Medea herself is described as a powerful enchantress. In the Argonautika, she gets these powers through her worship of the Titan goddess Hecate, and is described as spending very little time in Aeetes' palace because she is always working in Hecate's temple. But when Jason arrived in Colchis and made his way to the palace, Medea was there. Upon seeing the hero walk through the halls, she instantly fell in love with him. In the Argonautika, this love verges on obsession and is caused by the power of the goddess Aphrodite through her son Eros' arrows. Apollonius has Medea as the victim of Aphrodite's charms, and other versions also have this too. However, not all. Sometimes she has more control, and it is Jason's own physique which charms her. Due to love, regardless of its actual cause, Medea ends up helping Jason in his quest after he promises to marry her. Her father gave Jason an impossible task: to yoke together 2 huge fire-breathing bronze bulls, use them to plow a field, sow dragon's teeth in the furrows created by the plow, and then defeat an army of men that springs up from the planted ground. It's a well-established part of the story, and was known at least 200 years earlier than Apollonius in the work of the poet Pindar. Thanks to Medea's spells and potions, Jason was able to complete the task. When her father began to plot to destroy Jason and his Argonaut companions anyway, Medea scurried from the palace in the middle of the night and warned the hero. Together, her and Jason snuck to the wooded grove where the Golden Fleece was kept. Medea immobilized the dragon serpent guarding it, and they stole it before sailing away in the Argo. But Aeetes was not to be so easily dealt with. He sent the Colchians after the heroes, including Medea's brother, Absyrtus. When the Colchians caught up and surrounded them, Medea and Jason cruelly instigated the death of Absyrtus, and the Argo escaped. When they later ran into the Colchians again, Medea and Jason were quickly married, and had sex for the first time to consummate the relationship. This was because, at the time, their host threatened to send her back to her father if she was still an unmarried maiden. The rationale here is that, back in ancient Greece, an unmarried maiden was, essentially, the property of her father, and marriage transferred this property to the husband. Medea and Jason were now married, and continued on to Jason's home in Iolcos. In the Argonautika, Medea is still helpful at certain points on the way back from Colchis, but to my mind, she retreats into the background somewhat. Most of the help the Argonauts get at this portion of their adventure comes from goddesses, Hera being the main one. So that's a rough summary of Medea's role in the quest for the Golden Fleece. And of course, the main source is Apollonius' Argonautika from the 3rd century BC. But what do we know from other periods of ancient Greece? The earliest surviving source linking Medea to the Golden Fleece adventure is a couple hundred years older, going back to the 7th century BC. In one of his poems, Mimnermus sings that Jason would never have succeeded without her help. The her here is not specified. It could refer to Athena or Hera, but it's highly likely it's Medea since a relationship is implied in the surrounding text, and Mimnermus is primarily known for his erotic love poems. Jason first wins Medea in order to win the Golden Fleece. So Medea is very important, and not at all a damsel in distress like we often find in classic fairy tales. In fact, many scholars have pointed this out. In many fairy tales and folklore and myths around the world, there is a pattern where a young male hero will go on an adventure, kill a monster, or retrieve a treasure, all as a kind of test. And if they pass the test, they get the ultimate object of their desire, a beautiful young woman, usually a princess. So success in the adventure wins the princess. In the Golden Fleece myth, according to Mimnermus, it's the opposite. Winning the princess leads to success in the adventure. But what about other literature from Greece's archaic period? Jason and Medea's adventure is also referenced in Hesiod's Theogony. To paraphrase some different translations of Hesiod, Jason, after he had fulfilled the grievous toils which the great and overbearing king Pelias imposed on him, Jason, by the counsels of the immortal gods, carried off from Aeetes his daughter Medea. After having toiled much, Jason arrived at Iolcos, bearing in his ship a dark-eyed maiden, and her he made his blooming bride. In the Theogony, Hesiod hints at the typical fairy tale pattern. Medea is treated as Jason's prize. There is also artistic evidence that suggests that this was not just a literary choice made by Hesiod only. There is a vase from around 500 BC which shows Jason with the help of Athena getting the Golden Fleece from its serpent guardian. Medea is absent from the picture, maybe because this artwork referred to a version where Jason had to complete his adventure before getting Medea, or at least where the goddesses were the main helpers. A few hundred years later, Apollonius's Argonautika presents a combination of these two versions of Medea. Like with Mimnermus, Medea in the Argonautika is the reason Jason succeeds. She even points this out to the heroes themselves, shaming them when she finds out that some of them want to abandon her. Medea gave a potion to Jason so he could survive the fire-breathing bulls. Medea warned the Argonauts when her father planned to kill all of them in the dead of night. Medea put the serpent to sleep so Jason could get his hands on the Golden Fleece. And Medea planned her brother's murder so the Argonauts could escape. Medea did all of this because she loved Jason, so Jason won Medea first before succeeding on the adventure. But Apollonius also seems to use the Medea as a final prize perspective. Throughout his work, even though we get plenty of examples of her capabilities, Apollonius presents Medea as young, vulnerable, and full of emotions. Throughout the poem, Medea is constantly torn between her duties to her father and her intense desire for Jason. The reader or listener even gets an insight into her thought process. And there is a strong scene where before she decides to help Jason, Medea wakes up in the middle of the night and repeatedly moves around her bedroom, moving towards the door and then losing her nerve and moving back to the bed. She practically crawls up the walls with anxiety. In fact, she never actually builds up enough gumption to leave. One of her handmaidens notices her distress and finally brings her sister to see what's wrong. And then there's also the timing of Jason and Medea's actual marriage. In the Argonautika, they don't get married on their return to Greece, but instead a little earlier during the return voyage. But when they have sex at the end of the wedding ceremony, they do so on top of a couch draped with the Golden Fleece. I'd say that's a pretty clear image showing Jason getting the girl after completing the adventure. At the end of the Argonauts' adventure, Medea comes to Greece as Jason's wife. The Argonautika actually ends before they return home. What happens when Jason and Medea return to Iolcos is covered by other sources. However, the Argonautika does provide some hints at what will happen. Jason's immortal patron in the poem is the Queen of Heaven, the goddess Hera. She appears in various scenes with other immortals and expresses her fondness for Jason and her desire that he be successful in acquiring the Golden Fleece. But it is clear that Hera, as you would probably expect from a goddess, is playing the long game. She doesn't want Jason to succeed just because she likes him. Her real aim is to punish the king Pelias, who sent Jason on the quest. To do that, Hera wants Jason to go to Colchis, get the fleece, and return. But, in the process, she really wants him to bring back Medea, so the enchantress princess will cause the death of Pelias. Once in Iolcos, we get the strongest examples of Medea's magical powers, and these are first tied up with the fate of Jason's father, Aeson. In different versions, Aeson's fate is mixed. In Apollodorus's library, after Jason and the Argonauts departed on their adventure, Pelias decided, with his nephew out of the way, Aeson could be killed. Aeson was allowed to commit suicide by drinking a large amount of bull's blood. Blood is, ironically, poisonous for people to drink. Jason's mother also died, choosing to hang herself. Pelias also killed Jason's baby brother. In other versions, though, Aeson was alive when the heroes returned with the Golden Fleece. The Roman poet Ovid describes how Aeson, after many years of life and being imprisoned by Pelias, was now a feeble, weak old man, waiting for death to end his suffering. Jason, when he returned, begged his new wife Medea to use her powers to help his father. She promised to return his lost years, to rejuvenate him. For 9 days and 9 nights, she gathered all manner of special herbs and plants. She stayed away from Jason the entire time, and built 2 altars, one to Hecate and one to Hebe, the goddess of youth. Medea also dug trenches and offered sacrifice to Hades and Persephone. On the occasion for the ritual, she had her servants lead out Aeson and then depart, leaving them alone. Medea prepared a bubbling cauldron, and into the pot went all her gathered herbs. Finally, when the potion was ready, she took a sharp knife and cut Aeson's throat. She emptied his veins of all his old blood, and then refilled his body with her potion by pouring it into his mouth. His beard and hair grew dark. His thin frame grew strong. When he awoke, he was young again. Ovid, in typical Ovid fashion, gives the most colorful description of this event. But the 1st century BC Roman poet is not the only source who describes Aeson's rejuvenation. It is also found as far back as the 7th century BC. A surviving quote from the mostly lost archaic period poem Nostoi reads, "Medea made Aeson a sweet young boy, and stripped his old age from him by her cunning skill, when she had made a brew of many herbs in her golden cauldrons." Medea's actions in Iolcos are some of the earliest components of her myths. There is also some evidence from the early poets that Medea used her powers to rejuvenate Jason as well. And in art, on one Hydria vase from around the 475 BC, Medea is shown sprinkling potion over a ram in a boiling pot, intending to turn it back into a lamb. With Medea stands Jason. We know it's Jason because the man is clearly labeled on the artwork. He stands with one arm outstretched, maybe indicating he wants to go next. Ovid's later story involving Aeson is more well known today, but his descriptions make one thing clear. Medea had to slit the throat of Aeson before she could rejuvenate him. That means that her powers are much more than simply returning lost years. Her powers involve bringing people back from the dead. This is a dangerous, unnatural power, and in Greek myth there are often consequences for breaking the natural order in such a way. Another hero, Asclepius, could also bring back the dead, and Zeus killed him for this. Medea herself seems aware of what she can and can't get away with. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Jason initially asks her to take years off his own life and then give those years to his father. Medea is horrified by the request and refuses, saying, "How vile a crime has fallen from your lips," before suggesting her alternative of giving Aeson back his lost years. Medea is also aware of how controversial her entire ritual may be. When Aeson arrives for his rejuvenation, she makes sure her servants leave before she starts. In Iolcos, we get the most dramatic example of Medea's magical powers. And also in Iolcos, through these magical powers, she fulfills Hera's dark purpose for having her brought all the way from Colchis. The next Medea myth is well documented in the ancient Greek sources, from the 1st century BC and later. Diodorus, Hyginus, Ovid, Pausanias, and Apollodorus all give very decent descriptions of it. All of them say that when the Argonauts returned to Iolcos, Jason and Medea began planning the death of Pelias. In the versions where Jason's father died before he got home, revenge for the death of his father is the main reason. But in general, the whole affair, from start to finish, is a power struggle for who will rule the kingdom. Remember, Pelias originally outmaneuvered Aeson to seize the throne, and Aeson's imprisonment afterwards was supposed to prevent him from seizing it back. Pelias killing Aeson while Jason was gone was supposed to do the same thing. And now, with Jason back, we have the feud started up once again. Medea tells Jason she will solve his problem. Diodorus and Hyginus both have Medea present herself as being a priestess of the goddess Artemis, but the other sources have Medea's own reputation as an enchantress do the work. Medea either goes to Pelias's daughters herself, or is approached by them. Either way, she tells them she can rejuvenate their now old father and return him to his youth. In some versions, they are skeptical. In Ovid's, Medea had already rejuvenated Aeson, and the daughters are excited for her to do the same to their father. But in all the sources, she first provides a live demonstration of her power. In front of Pelias's daughters, Medea butchered an old wizened ram. She ran her knife along its neck, and then boiled the body in a large pot with a number of herbs and strange things. Eye of newt, toe of frog, that sort of thing. And then out of the brew, Medea pulled a cute little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow, a youthful kick to its walk. Pelias's daughters were amazed, and they were convinced Medea could rejuvenate their father. So they killed Pelias, slitting his throat and butchering him like how Medea did with the ram. Medea directed them on what to do next, but eventually the daughters realized they were deceived, and the potion was not going to work. Ovid says Medea purposely used the wrong herbs this time, and there was no potency. Pelias, murdered by Medea and his own daughters, stayed dead. And with that, using Medea as an instrument, Hera's planned revenge on Pelias was complete. In Iolcos, Medea caused the death of Pelias either by herself or because Jason put her up to it. This is presented as being the concluding action in the struggle for the crown between Aeson and Jason and Pelias. The king is killed, but there are no versions where Jason succeeds in gaining the throne of Iolcos. As you can imagine, there were serious repercussions for the death of Pelias. Pelias's daughters fled the city. Pausanias records that they ended up in the wild lands of Arcadia. The crown passed to Pelias's son Acastus, who was also one of the heroes who accompanied Jason on his journey to get the Golden Fleece. It is for this past help that Diodorus and Hyginus have Jason and the Argonauts storm the palace and then allow Acastus to rule Iolcos. However, Apollodorus says that Acastus became king and then expelled Jason and Medea for their crime. Regardless of how exactly it happened, after the death of Pelias, the overall tradition has Iolcos pass to Acastus, and Jason and Medea go to Corinth. If you thought what Medea did in Iolcos was dramatic, what happens in Corinth brings it up a notch. The oldest known source for this story is the epic poem The Corinthiaka, composed by the poet Eumelus of Corinth around 730 BC. Eumelus was an archaic period bard, like Homer and Hesiod, although Eumelus was likely related in some way to the ruling family of Corinth. Several other epic poems were attributed to him. All are lost, and only survive in very limited fragments. The Greek Pausanias quotes the Corinthiaka in his own work, giving us a rough idea of what happened in Eumelus's poem. In the Corinthiaka, the people of Corinth send for Medea after the death of their ruler. They declare her to be the legitimate heir to the throne, which seems a random turn of events, but the situation is backed up in another archaic period fragment by a different poet named Simonides. With Medea queen, through her, Jason ruled as king. The dramatic part came when Jason and Medea started a family. The named children of Medea and Jason are a son named Medeus and a daughter, Areopis. They're named in different places. Medeus is referenced as early as Hesiod's Theogony. Otherwise, they may have had other nameless children too. Before this, Zeus tried to seduce Medea, but she, out of respect for Hera, refused the king of the universe. Because of this, she gained Hera's gratitude, and the goddess offered to make Medea's future children immortal. So, Medea, as her children were born, carried the babies to a temple to Hera. But in the process of making the children immortal, whatever that was, the babies died. Pausanias doesn't come out right and say this, but that interpretation is backed up by other surviving Corinthiaka fragments. Afterwards, Jason found out what Medea had done. She begged him to forgive her, but he refused, left her, and returned to Iolcos. Medea then left Corinth alone as well. That might be the earliest reason for the death of Jason's children, but it is not the only reason. In fact, around 431 BC, the Athenian playwright Euripides depicted a much more tragic description. The play is set in Corinth, after Jason, Medea, and their sons seek refuge after leaving Iolcos. In this version, Jason and Medea do not rule Corinth, but Jason decides to marry a second woman, Glauce, the daughter of Corinth's king, and demote Medea to being a mistress or concubine. Medea is devastated and incensed by Jason's betrayal. The play actually opens with her raging about it and being overheard by an old nursemaid who worries what she will do next. The king of Corinth also worries about how Medea will react. He decides to exile her, tells her so, but is convinced to let her stay one more day. Well, Medea made the most of the extra day. She reminds Jason all of the help she did for him, how she left her father and killed her brother all for him. But Jason is steadfast in his decision, pointing out the advantage of him marrying a Greek princess, when Medea is only a foreigner. So Medea goes and gets a magnificent golden robe that was a gift from the god Helios. Medea poisons the robe and sends her children to deliver it as a gift for the Corinthian princess Glauce. The princess puts on the robe and dies in excruciating agony. Her father, the king of Corinth, also dies, trying to help his dying daughter. He gets poisoned himself. When Jason discovers that Glauce and the king are dead, he knows Medea is to blame. He searches for his former wife, but when he finds her, he learns Medea killed their 2 children, too. At the end of the play, Medea mocks Jason's pain and declares he will suffer a bad fate. She then departs in a flying chariot, pulled by serpents, and disappears into the sky. It's a very dramatic and disturbing turn of events. Medea's violent character is very much the focus, and is shown repeatedly throughout the play. The killing of her own children is particularly disturbing, in part because it appears completely senseless and spiteful. So, why does Medea go to such lengths to punish Jason, when you would think she is also inflicting a great loss on herself? Part of the reason is because in many ancient Greek communities, marriage was a process where a woman was essentially lent to another family to produce children for the man. Medea reverses this, ending Jason's family line instead of allowing it to continue by producing offspring. Medea doesn't kill her children because they are hers. She kills them because they are Jason's. Nevertheless, she does kill her own children in the process, which certainly creates the shock of a good tragedy. Interestingly, this part of the play may have been Euripides' own take on the older Medea material. The thing is, these plays were part of contests, and the desire to win those contests encouraged innovation. What's more, the playwrights often focused on very specific moments within a story, which allowed them to go deeper into a character's motivation. Euripides was no different. He often explored themes of passion, vengeance, and their consequences. These elements in the Medea story are peak Euripides. In known older versions, Medea either kills her children, usually trying to make them immortal, or the people of Corinth kill them. According to a fragmentary note one ancient Greek left on a copy of Euripides' Medea play, a group of Corinthians may have even paid Euripides to come up with his Medea as the sole murderer version to take some of the heat off of Corinth. Nevertheless, this event, and Euripides' especially shocking descriptions of it, overshadowed much of the other Medea myths where she helped the Argonauts or resurrected Aeson. Over and over again, later literary and artistic works retell this version. Hyginus follows Euripides almost exactly. He only adds that the poisoned robe caused Glauce to burn to death, kind of like how Heracles was also burned to death with a poisoned robe, and that both Glauce's father and Jason were killed trying to help her. Medea still kills both of Jason's children before fleeing Corinth, even though their father is already dead. Apollodorus also shares that the robe caused Glauce to be consumed in painful flames. Medea flees the city in a chariot pulled by winged serpents. Apollodorus says she either killed her children or they were killed by the Corinthian people. Greek vase art, made after the time of Euripides, associated Medea with child murdering more and more. One famous example from 400 BC looks like the final scene of Euripides' play, with Medea riding away on her serpent chariot, and the dead bodies of her sons laid out on an altar below. Roman art, especially the scenes at places like Pompeii, did much the same, but showing Medea contemplating killing her children before actually doing it. Other Roman art, like those on some sarcophagi, focus on the other murders of Medea, showing the delivery of poisoned robes and the king's failed attempts to help his daughter as she flails around covered in flames. Back to literature. The Roman poets Ovid and Seneca also covered Medea, although they took different approaches. Ovid was more nuanced in his study of Medea and covers her betrayal by Jason. Seneca mostly takes the same position as the earlier Euripides. His play, also called Medea, follows Euripides' story very closely. Seneca had Medea kill her own children from a rooftop before she flies away in the chariot. Besides this, Seneca shows Medea as a wicked witch, spending time describing her evil potions and rituals. Even though Euripides' play is the main source that makes people today familiar with Medea, this was not always the case. Euripides' play was actually lost during the Middle Ages. During that time, the main source for this Medea myth was Seneca's play, which captured the popular imagination and even influenced the depictions of witches, like the Weird Sisters and Sycorax in William Shakespeare's plays Macbeth and The Tempest. Later, in the Renaissance, Euripides' Medea was rediscovered and slowly became the more famous version we know today. Before moving on, there's another angle to Medea's time in Corinth that I want to discuss. But to do so, I have to first go back to Medea's origins. As I already mentioned, Medea was the daughter of Aeetes, the king of Colchis. Aeetes himself was the son of the sun god Helios and a nymph named Perseus. As the son of two immortals, Aeetes is not technically human, and presumably belongs to the same large tribe the immortal gods, titans, and many nymphs all belong to. He's not really imagined as a human either. He's more a magician king living in a special place far away. And what's more, the task he gives Jason, to use fire-breathing bulls to plow a field and then fight an army of men who grow out of it, is something Aeetes says he does all the time, for fun, and presumably doesn't need Medea's magic to get it done. So in other words, Aeetes is particularly godlike, as you would expect from someone with two immortal parents. Medea was the daughter of this godlike son of Helios. Her mother was from the same group of nymphs Aeetes' mother was from. So Medea also has the same immortal genealogy, and this means she was likely not considered a human. This possible immortal status of Medea also goes all the way back to the Archaic period. Medea and Jason's relationship is mentioned as early as Hesiod's Theogony, in the 7th century BC. But where it's mentioned in the Theogony is important. It's in a special section where Hesiod talks about various matches between immortal women and mortal men, the obvious implication being that Medea was considered a goddess. Fast forward a couple hundred years to Euripides' Medea play, and consider how she was presented to the audience. It's not a consistent picture. At the beginning, Medea herself claims to be a helpless woman, who Jason had done wrong to through his choice to pursue the Corinthian princess. But at the same time, Medea is shown to be extremely capable. She points out the past help she gave Jason when they first got together, and she calls herself Zeus's agent to punish Jason for his past sins. And then she kills Jason's children, a spiteful and horrifying act because they are still her children. To ancient Greek audiences, Medea's magic, cleverness, and her ability to sacrifice personal connections suggested she's more than what she initially appears. But something more is this. Medea herself is never punished for her actions. She escapes from Colchis after killing her brother. She escapes from Iolcos after killing Pelias. She escapes Corinth after killing her children. If Medea were immortal, she would have been punished, since she is breaking Zeus's laws. If she was immortal, she wouldn't, since the gods play by their own rules. All of this gives the audience two things to think about. If Medea is divine, that means the gods can come among us and carry out their fickle desires in terrible ways. If she is human, that means sometimes evil crimes can go unpunished. Both ideas are disturbing, but this question of Medea's nature is reinforced in the final scene of the play. After killing her children, she rides away victorious in a flying chariot. It makes the audience wonder, was Medea ever the helpless woman she claimed to be? And was Jason doomed from the start, since so many humans who do have relationships with Greek gods and goddesses often don't benefit in the end? And that's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. As always, thank you for listening.